In this talk, we'll take a look at how Vue's seemingly magical reactivity system actually works. So please welcome in with a magical hand, Peer Fisser.
Thank you very much. I'll start out with a quick question. How many of you have worked with VueJS before? Right, nice. At least some people. So I'll start out with this image, which I actually want to show from the beginning. So let's see if a browser refresh will do the trick. Nope. There it goes. This to me shows one of the most fascinating images of the last couple of years. This is an image of the Andromeda galaxy. And what's so special about this is that this image is so detailed that they can actually zoom in and look at the individual stars that make up this, this galaxy, which is actually the nearest galaxy to our own, but it's still 2.5 million light years away. That's so distant that typically you don't see the individual stars. I mean, you can see stars on this picture, but those are actually stars in the foreground. Those are part of our own Milky Way. You know, those are typically about a couple of thousand light years away. But the ones in the background, the far, far background, we're zooming into that now, you can see these tiny little dots. All those little specks are just billions of stars in what's our closest, nearest neighbor galaxy. Absolutely fascinating. So, enough about that. I'm going to say a little bit about myself. I studied physics, but I turned out to be a web developer. Both topics are absolutely fascinating to me. I also love games. I love playing them, and I love building them and modding them. So in this talk, we're going to look at a little bit of history of the front-end landscape. We're going to look at the virtual DOM, what it means, and then we're going to have a quick look through the Vue features. I mean, obviously, we're not going to have time to go into all of the wonderful tools and features that Vue has to offer. So I'm going to focus on the reactivity system and explain how that can boost your productivity in front-end development. So let's see if I can get my speaker notes. I messed up, didn't I? I'm just going to refresh once more and then do it from my speaker notes. Ha! There we go. All right, so starting with the history of front-end frameworks, it's already 2010 that AngularJS came out. In terms of front-end frameworks, that's ancient, right? That's almost prehistoric. But AngularJS was a huge success. Many devs started for the first time building large front-end applications, right? And then 3 years later, React entered the scene. It introduced us to this new concept called the virtual DOM. So what is the virtual DOM? We know the DOM is like a data structure that you define in your HTML, right? So this, because it's a data structure, you can also represent this in JavaScript. And why would we do this? Because it's expensive to update the DOM, but it's very inexpensive to update the virtual DOM. A typical page exists of thousands of DOM nodes, and having many small updates can really slow down your page. So this approach was revolutionary. I mean, performance-wise, AngularJS got knocked out of the water, and it was so popular. Many front-end frameworks would later also use virtual DOM, including VueJS. So 2014, a developer at Google called Evan You, he open-sourced his pet project called VueJS. And it got picked up by the Laravel community, and also React's license, it was a little bit restrictive. So the Apache Foundation actually took the drastic step of banning the library because they thought the license was too restrictive. So then a lot of React developers started noticing Vue as a viable alternative to React. 2 years later, we got Angular 2. That same year, actually half a year earlier, Evan You would go on to work full-time on VueJS. It was actually that popular. and it's being paid for by donations. And that brings us to today, the Infi-Con, and the slide we saw just a moment ago. And this is the slide you are seeing right now. So, why is Vue awesome? It uses the virtual DOM, as we've discussed. It tries to avoid bias, right? According to the docs, the core team tries very hard to avoid bias. And this is noticeable when you see so many different ways in which you can set up your project. You can use TypeScript, but it's optional. You can use single file components or class-based components. You can use templates or render functions with or without JSX. So you can really tailor your development experience to your own preference or needs. It has a very powerful CLI that also comes with a web user interface with which you can manage multiple VueJS projects. You can manage your NPM packages. You can inspect bundle size, see which parts of your app take up the most amount of memory. It has this very nice plugin system with which you can add features that may require multiple NPM packages and or configuration. It's very fast. This is a link to benchmarks in case you would like to review this presentation. You can click it and it will take you to some benchmark tests. It's backed by its users, which means that user feedback and concerns are absolute priority. It has a huge ecosystem, documentation, libraries, theming, and testing utilities, to name but a few. It's very easy to set up progressive web applications. That's when you use a service worker and your web application can be installed on, for example, your smartphone. And for the user, it becomes indistinguishable from an app, right? So you've actually made a web application, but you've actually also made an app. You can do things like server-side rendering. You can do it's very easy to do code splitting. Code splitting is when you, instead of compiling all your JavaScript to a single bundle, you compile into separate, smaller bundles for different parts of your application, and that way your website becomes more performant. And it has a very nice reactivity system, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. So what is reactivity, right? Reactivity, in a nutshell, is whenever I update something of my state, anything depending on that state should update as well. Or if you want it really simple, updating stuff updates other stuff. So let's look at a typical Vue component. This is a simple Vue component that uses three options: data, computed, and render. And from the looks of it, it's some kind of shopping basket item because it has a price and an amount in its data. And then it has a computed property which returns the product of the two, price times the amount. And then the total price is used in the render function. So the question now is, how can we make this reactive? Which means that if I change something in the price or amount, I want my render function to trigger and re-render the total price. So how can I achieve that given this setup? And the answer is, it's already done for you behind the screens. I mean, VueJS is reactive out of the box. You can just set price and set the amount, and you don't need to do any queries on the document or update the DOM. You don't need to call some kind of set data function. You don't need RxJS with observables or subscriptions. Just assign a new value to price, and anything depending on the price, either directly or indirectly, will update. So this reactivity model relieves us from a great deal of cognitive overhead, and that's one of the reasons why it gives us such a great productivity boost. But how does it actually work? And now I'm going to demonstrate how that reactivity model actually works behind the screens. And I'm just going to switch to sharing my screen, and hopefully everything is going to work out. A live demo. We're going to code reactivity together. So I have a demo folder here. It contains only some HTML, some styling, and some script. Let me just zoom in for you. Is this clear enough? I'll take that as yes. So this isn't really loading anything, right? This is just an HTML page with some CSS. and we're gonna manipulate the DOM. So I'm gonna get document, get element by ID. My element is called title. I'm gonna say const title is this. And I'm gonna set the inner text to hello Infi-Con. And it works. So now I'm going to make use of this state, right? I have this state. I'm going to render it in my DOM. State.x. All right, that works. Now, what I mean with we want this to be reactive, it means that whenever I change the state like this, say 42, then I would want my DOM to update. In other words, whenever I do this, I want this to trigger, because this statement actually depends on state.x, right? But how do I achieve this? I mean, this is just an assignment, and this is just an assignment. How can I make this reactive? So I need some way to trigger this when I do this, right? So if I want to make this triggerable, I have to make this a function. So I'm just going to call this one render. Now we're back to our loading state because render has not been called. I'm going to call render. Now I want render to be called automatically after I set the state. So I want basically this. So if I'm going to see 42, hello Infi-Con 42 on my screen, then I'm going to know I've achieved reactivity. So this render function, how can I trigger this render function just by setting x in my state? And the answer is I can use the object API and I can define getters and setters. So I use object define property, and I should actually do this for all of my properties in my state. So I'm going to say object keys, my state, and then I'm going to do it for each. So for each key, I'm going to define a property on my state for my key, and now I can use getters and setters. I can use get, and I can use a set. But I need to have access to the inner value. So I'm going to define the inner value here. And I'm going to start out with the initial value of my state. Then get is going to simply return the inner value, and set is simply going to set the inner value. Of course, that's a parameter of my set method. Well, let's see if there are any errors. No errors. Everything seems to work. Right, so now I have a getter and setter. I have access to logic just by setting my x to 42. So somehow I want inside my getter, I want to somehow subscribe my render function. And here I want to call my render function. So this reminds me of the observer pattern. I can define an array. I'm going to call it subscribers. And, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to subscribe yet, but I do know that if my subscriber array is going to contain lambda functions, then I can just do this, right? For each const sub of subscribers, call the function. All right, so we're halfway there. And how am I going to subscribe whenever I get something from my state? The problem here is that the getter doesn't know who is calling the getter. So I need to set it in advance. I need to have, say, a target. I'm just going to set it to null. And I'm going to wrap this lambda function into an observe function. So I'm going to define an observe function. And the observe function is simply going to set the target. Then it's going to call the function. And finally, it's going to reset the target. Observe. And so now I'm going to wrap my lambda function inside of the observe. Right, no errors there. But it's still Infi-Con 1, not hello Infi-Con 42. So we're not reactive yet. We're almost there. We simply have to subscribe our target. That's the last thing we need to do. So let's first check if the target is actually there. And also let's make sure that the subscribers doesn't already contain the targets. And subscribers. Ah, thank you. I'm just going to copy paste. Subscribe. Curse of the demo. Includes. So it should not include the target. And then we can push it onto our subscriber array. Excellent. And now we've achieved reactivity. And to prove that it's actually reactive, I'm going to go here into my console log, and I'm going to mutate the state again. State.x equals 2019. Beautiful. So this is how VueJS achieves reactivity behind the screens. And well, let's celebrate by calling this decorate method. Wow. Now it looks ridiculous. So I hope that kind of demystifies the reactivity done by VueJS. And I'm going to go back to my presentation now.
To be clear, this is what VueJS does for you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Is this VueJS?
Yeah.
No. That wasn't VueJS, but this is what VueJS uses to achieve reactivity. If I would dive into the source code, you would see a whole lot of other stuff that VueJS does. In this talk, I just want to focus on the reactivity, because there are some caveats. The object API cannot do everything for you. So that's why I'm showing you this. I'm going to back to
easily crash stuff if you have two subscribers changing each other's. So if you say you set to 2019 and a listener subscribes and changes it back to 18 and another one goes and changes back to 2019 and whatever, and then you're
any update is going to just trigger all the subscribers again. Yep, that's what it means to have a reactive system.
And I take it if VueJS helps you out in that sense.
Yeah, so the question is basically, will it trigger an alert if you get a circular subscription?
Yeah.
A circular subscription.
Yeah, so you subscribe A to B and B to A.
I'm not sure if that's actually possible in VueJS,
Yeah,
because the subscribing happens behind it. I mean, you're not actually subscribing. You're just defining your Vue components, and the subscribing is done by VueJS. So I'm pretty sure that they make sure that you're not going to get any circular subscriptions. Yeah. Back to my presentation. Let's see. All right, so what's reactive in VueJS? We saw that properties are reactive using getters and setters, but what about array methods? Well, thankfully, Vue conveniently provides wrappers for all of these array methods so that they will notify the subscribers of that array. But sadly, there are some things that we simply cannot intercept with the Object API, specifically setting an array value by index and dynamically adding properties. If you want to do that and make it reactive, you have to use the VueSet method. So instead of this, you should write this. Or instead of this, adding a new property, you would do it like this. So in that last piece of code, the VueSet will not only notify the subscribers, but it will also make that property reactive. So while the Object API cannot intercept these assignments, there is a different API in ECMAScript 5 that can. It's called Proxies. And this is the syntax for a proxy. The target is the original thing you need to access, and the handler contains the interceptors for whatever you need, such as set or get. And it has a whole list, a gigantic list of other interceptors that you can use. And this is what it would look like if we would use the proxy API instead of the Object API in order to achieve reactivity. So the question is, why don't we use proxies, right? Because if we use these getters and setters, they just catch everything, including array setting or adding new properties. So why don't we use proxies? And the answer is, they're only supported by evergreen browsers. And they're unshimmable, there's no polyfill, and there's no way to fake them in older browsers. So for the upcoming versions of Vue, there's actually going to be a parallel version called -next. If you don't need to support IE11, use that one. You get proxies, and you don't need VueSet anymore. But if you do, use the regular version 2.x, but don't forget about VueSet. So I want to quickly talk about events. Events are super easy to emit in VueJS. In any component, anywhere, you can simply say this $emit, and it will emit to only the parent. If you want to emit to a grandparent, then you would have to re-emit. So this is what it would look like in the template of the parent, right? You listen to an update amount event, and then you re-emit to the grandparent. And sometimes your forms are complicated, right? You can have these really big forms, and then you have to emit a couple of levels upwards and then pass the event downwards to another component that needs it down here. So whenever you come into a complicated situation like that, it's much easier to use the store, the Vuex store. So communicate events using Vuex. The Vuex store is very similar to a component. So we've looked at a component, we've looked at the data computed property, and it also has methods. In a Vuex store, where you have data in a component, you now have a state in the store. And the state is also reactive. Where you have computed properties in a component, now you have getters in a store. And whereas you would have methods in a component, in a store you have actions and mutations. So this is what a typical store could look like. Similar to the component we saw earlier, this time our price and amount is contained within state, and we have a getter for the total price. So imagine you have a very complicated form. You have some component A here and another component B over there, and you need to communicate somehow that something has changed, right? So what you would do is you would write a mutation in your store, like this, which is very easy. It takes a state and a payload, and it sets a value on that state, which triggers the subscribers. You can trigger this mutation in component A by calling store.commit. And finally, in component B, you can just use a getter, and it will subscribe to the total price, which in turn subscribes to price and amount. So everything is reactive. It's very easy to do, and that's basically how it would work. There are more things you can do with this. You can use watchers, with which you could trigger other logic if you would need, but that's outside of the scope of this presentation. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for your attention.